A tremendous, meaty slap echoed over the ruins, accompanied by the guttural moans of the blood-meat hulks. The Baroness Wraith darted between the three massive undead brutes, baiting them to attack its incorporeal form in such a way that their ponderous blows would strike one another. Ainz had to admire the degree of fine control that the Baroness had gained over her new soldier, which was impossible to achieve with the limited means of pet direction in Yggdrasil, but it didn't change the fact that the variation on her previous tactic would not work. Though not strictly zombies, blood-meat hulks had the same rough balance as one, adjusted to its higher level. They had large health pools and made powerful, but unwieldy attacks. Their size gave them reach that smaller zombies did not have, and being grappled by one could be problematic. What truly set them above regular zombies, however, was their ability to regenerate. Combined with their toughness, the weaker undead that the Baroness was using to clear the area dealt insufficient damage to overwhelm a blood-meat hulk's ability to recover its health. Perhaps some clever method could be devised to get rid of one, but 3 was out of the question. The Baroness continued her attempts to have them destroy one another, but she seemed to realize that her efforts were futile. The wraith floated to a point above the 3 lumbering undead, who kept clambering over one another in their attempts to reach it. She stood at a distance, observing them quietly with a frown. "Have you encountered these before, Saradnik Dono?" The noblewoman glanced over to where he had floated down nearby, then turned her attention back to the blood-meat hulks again. "No, Your Majesty," she replied. "They almost seem like zombies, but they don't appear to take any damage." Ainz silently smiled to himself. They were taking damage, but it was being delivered in the form of bludgeoning attacks. With how massive they were, it was impossible to tell through visual cues. They had no skin to display bruises and no broken bones to note, only a mass of muscle and fat that constantly regenerated the internal damage received. "Well, I won't ruin your fun." Blood-meat hulks were at the top end of low-tier undead, meaning that the ones before them should have been somewhere around level 19. That the Baroness, who could sense the strength of her opponents, did not immediately give up lent to the idea that his estimate was at least close. After a few dozen seconds, she rolled the banner of the Sorceress Kingdom up around the haft of her weapon, putting the spear away to replace it with another. "So this is your answer?" Ainz asked. The Baroness nodded quietly. "What about the troops that you left outside the ruin?" She turned around to look up at him, lightly planting the base of her spear on the ground. "There is an order to battle," she said. "An order to strength. This is what I was taught, at least. The strength of a group, be it a patrol, raid, army or nation, is organized according to that order." As a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom, Ainz noted, "You should be well aware of how powerful our armies are. Do you still believe these teachings hold any truth to them?" "It is in my brief time acting as a commander in the Sorceress Kingdom's army," the Baroness replied, "that I came to understand this as a truth that can be found anywhere. The weak comprise the majority, while strong individuals become increasingly scarce the higher one goes. As this is the case, a leader must determine how to order things to the best effect. While the scale of the Sorceress Kingdom's forces is vastly different, this truth remains." "I see," Ainz said. "Then I suppose it is best to hear your explanation in its entirety." The Baroness fell silent for a moment, then she looked down to the cracked earth as a hint of embarrassment colored her cheeks. "Forgive me for my presumption, Your Majesty," she said. "As a mighty sovereign possessed of unfathomable wisdom, it is a subject in which you must hold a far superior understanding than myself." I don't? Wait, why are you walking away, tell me?" Ainz wanted to spin the Baroness back around and shake the information out of her. As the Sorcerer King, however, he could not betray any ignorance on a topic that people thought he should thoroughly understand. He brooded over how to have her continue her explanation as she brooded over how to deal with the blood-meat hulks. "You're certain that this is your only option?" he asked. "Within the limits that you've set for my task," she answered, "yes. In many ways, it's not unlike the situation I would have found myself in as a member of a frontier house in Riestais, if not for the appearance of the Sorceress Kingdom. Most of Riestais's nobles are of civilian leanings, if I'm not mistaken. Most of their fighting was done by levies, retainers or hirelings. Does being a member of one of Riestais's frontier houses truly demand such risks?" "I've recently discovered that it's not the case for all frontier territories," the Baroness said. "Those in the north of Eranthal, for instance, had a powerful being suppressing threats from the Great Forest of Tob. They could afford a more civilian style of involvement in their territories. Free Rantal's southwestern frontier, however, this was not the case. Wilderness tribes and monsters are plentiful, and our vigilance cannot waver. It wasn't like the inland territories where intermittent and isolated threats are dealt with by adventurers. If the frontier was attacked and insufficient defenders were on hand, the first sign of anything having happened would be the next territory being attacked. Relying on a potentially weeks-long response from the nearest town or city will, of course, result in tragedy. Millions would perish if a major invasion was underway. Having personally dealt with various threats to the Duchy as Moman, Ainz knew well of what she spoke. If Ian Nobbe had not been conveniently on hand to deal with several major border threats, such as an undead horde that had spilt over from the Katsa Plains and a goblin alliance that had risen out of the Great Forest of Tob, the results that the Baroness described would have indeed been the case. One might say that frontier nobles are the earliest form of the nobility, she continued. We are most needed when a nation is still young and requires leaders of martial focus to secure its newly founded territories. In addition to being leaders, we are also what amounts to a career officer. War is our primary obligation, be it in the defense of a border or the expansion of it. Over the generations, members of militant noble houses are essentially bred for war. This means that we have the potential to be far stronger than the average person, and I suppose this is where those orders of strength come in. In Reistais, this order is fairly simple. You have tenants with contractual obligations for military service, the levy, vocational forces such as militia and household men-at-arms, then highly capable forces in a personal retinue such as knights or accomplished adventurers and mercenaries looking to settle down. With the regular nobility, this is the highest level from a martial standpoint. In a militant house, however, it is members of that house that occupy the last and highest level of that hierarchy. This is ideally speaking, of course, as strength is not consistent with breeding from generation to generation. Members of a frontier house have the most time to train and the greatest means to equip themselves. This is also ideally speaking. House Zaradnik has never been very wealthy, but we managed to get by. I see, Ainz nodded. So being raised under this type of hierarchy, you consider it your obligation as a martial noble to face opponents that your subordinates cannot? This is why you have chosen to face the Bloodmeat Hulks in the place of your troops. That's right, the Baroness nodded. I suppose if I were to put it in the Sorceress Kingdom's terms, it's that matches should be level appropriate, lest one squanders what each rank in this order of strength is suited for. Just as the strong have their place, so do the weak. Levies are better back at their usual places of work and professional troops can provide more coverage of territory than a single strong individual. Those at the pinnacle of strength keep opponents at that level in check so they cannot wreak havoc on those weaker than them. And what if you cannot match the pinnacle of an opponent's strength? Baroness Zaradnik offered a sardonic smile to the mist before her upon hearing his question. If you cannot surrender, she said, then you flee. If you cannot flee, then you fight and hope it's deterrent enough to survive. If not, then that is the way of things. The advent of conflict often comes with a foregone conclusion. It is what comes before that determines the result. Thanks to the tenets of our faith, my family has at least been able to cultivate a bloodline that was capable of carrying out its duties. It is something that every nation should pursue, but only the slain theocracy has successfully done so to my knowledge. Wilderness tribes as well, strangely enough, though I suppose the rise of strong lord-class demi-humans is more a product of their violently competitive cultures. The Baroness seemed to settle herself, taking a deep breath before walking forward, spear in hand. After determining that the Bloodmeat Hulks, who were still jostling with one another in their attempts to reach the wraith overhead, would not turn to attack her, she made an additional study of them at close range. Despite being level 19, the zombie-like mechanical aspects of Bloodmeat Hulks meant that a lower-level player of sufficient skill could handily defeat them. That being said, 3 at once for a poorly equipped individual still seemed sketchy, even if they possessed a theoretical level 15 monster build. Ability boost. Ainz frowned, glancing down at the sound of the martial art activation. Was she doing it for his benefit? Wind stride. The Baroness darted forward, opening a long gash with the tip of her spear as she shot by one of the Bloodmeat Hulks. Her target's health dropped by a sliver to Ainz's life essence, then ticked back to full as its wound closed over a few seconds. With her attack, All three blood meat hulks turned to chase after her. I guess she ran by because she figured they would do that, but what next? She mentioned his restrictions, so it was unlikely that she would resort to bow-kiting them. At the end of a thin trail of dust, the Baroness turned and charged again. Another long gash trailed across the torso of the same blood meat hulk, and she was gone again before they could swing at her. Heinz floated closer to the confrontation, leaning forward as he tried to guess at what she was doing. Is she imitating you, Schultier? I don't think so, Summer. I've never fought like that in front of her. The attacks were reminiscent of a lance charge, save for the slashing pass. The Baroness made another, but this time his life essence displayed a larger drop in the blood meat hulk's health. Before she came around again, however, it had regenerated to full. She used a martial art, Schultier noted. Is that so? I watched her fight once in a while back when she still participated in adventurer training. Any time a normal-looking attack deals more damage than it should, it's nearly always a martial art, aren't you? Since she's already maintaining ability boost and wind stride, the attack was a first-stage strike art. Her mundane attacks barely scratch the blood meat hulks through their layers of fat and muscle, but the additional damage from the martial art is quite telling. Heinz nodded in silent agreement. The layers of flesh served as natural armor of sorts, so Schultier's explanation about the additional damage was mechanically sound. As for martial arts, according to the data analyzed by Mayer and Pandora's actor, the resource system that drove martial arts was broken down into three components. The first, most basic component was physical endurance. Once one ran out of stamina, one could not perform martial arts. A certain alchemist he knew had developed working stamina potions, but Heinz feared what would become of him if his supply was taken away to distribute amongst the adventurers. How does he not have a kid on the way already, anyway? The second component was something like presence of mind. If the body was the vessel that performed martial arts, then the mind was what provided the steps that the body performed. Thirdly was a hard resource system, which they had loosely termed focus levels. It was not a system where an amount was expended, but reserved. The current consensus was that one gained a single focus level for every 5 warrior-type levels, that was, fighter variants, rangers, paladins, blackguards, and cavalry classes. Monks had their own system, which revolved around the use of a key pool. Martial arts that were maintained like a buff tied up focus levels, while those that functioned like on-use activations required that one had the focus levels available to activate them. There existed techniques that allowed one to break their limits to gain additional focus levels temporarily, but trying to forcefully perform martial arts beyond one's limit inflicted a significant amount of physical damage to the user. The Baroness used Ability Boost, a first-stage boost art that improved physical attributes, wind stride, another first-stage boost art that increased movement speed, and presumably something like Slash, which was a first-stage strike art. The first two martial arts tied up 2 focus levels, while the third required 1 to use. Since she sensed that the level 16 skeleton warriors were stronger than herself, the 3 focus levels in use would mean that she was level 15. No, wait, that can't be right, can it? She has at least 1 racial class level in Revenant, which should leave her 1 level short of having enough combined warrior-type levels for those 3 focus levels, unless we're getting something wrong. That should be the case, right? The 2 possibilities that fit within his current mechanical knowledge were that the Baroness had leveled in a warrior-type job class since jacking the skeleton warriors, or that her racial class levels qualified as levels in a certain job class archetype. He wasn't sure if one could gain a level within a day, but she might have been on the edge of leveling already. If her racial class levels qualified as certain job class levels, however, she was potentially quite powerful build-wise. Heinz made a mental note to have her check the skeleton warriors again after they were done. Below, Baroness Zaradnik continued her methodical testing of the blood meat hulks. She was becoming more daring, or was it more confident? The mindless nature of her opponents meant that they never learned how to fight her no matter how many times she made her probing attacks. She should be just about ready to go, Schultier said. You've watched her fight opponents like these before? Mare doesn't use blood meat hulks very often in the adventurer training area, Schultier shook her head. However, Ludmilla tends to feel out her opponents before attacking in earnest. It doesn't matter if she's fighting them personally or fighting them as a commander. Once she believes that she's gained a sufficient understanding of her opponents, she will move to strike them down. On her next approach, the Baroness made the same, slashing attack, followed by a piercing strike to her target's side. The blood-meat Hulk issued a low moan, raising its arm high. As it did so, however, it was jostled by the other two shoving their way by to get at her. She danced back from their ponderous blows, darting forward as their fists struck the ground where she once stood. Her spear lanced out at the first blood-meat Hulk, splitting into three as it did against the zombie wyvern. The crimson points of Ainz's eyes flared as the undead brute was knocked onto its back. This wasn't because she had managed to knock down her bulky adversary, but because of what he saw in his life essence. The attack had not only reduced the blood-meat Hulk's health by a quarter, but the Baroness as well. Before he could think too much on it, black arrows rained onto the fallen undead, followed by the brilliant flare of magic arrow spells. Most of the arrows bounced off or were otherwise ineffective, but the spells had no issues hitting home. The projectiles pummeled the blood-meat Hulk until it lay still on the ground. Still being chased by the other two blood-meat Hulks, the Baroness came around, reaching into her infinite haversack to retrieve a crystal vial. She popped it open and tossed it on her fallen adversary as she jogged by. A soft hiss filled the air, and the form of the blood-meat Hulk started to melt away. After confirming that the blood-meat Hulk was destroyed, the Baroness turned to face the remaining two, preparing for her next charge. Ainz shook his head, wondering why he thought that it would be 3 against 1 in the first place. As the Baroness took the fight to her two remaining adversaries, the ranks of skeleton archers and skeleton mages that had appeared out of the mist to rain destruction upon the fallen blood-meat Hulk formed up neatly nearby. With someone engaging them in direct melee, the two undead brutes did not turn towards them even after their fellow was abruptly slaughtered. Ainz mused over the scene, reminded of those old shows where villains would duel a hero in the presence of their minions. If the fight became inconvenient, the villain would unabashedly display their cowardly, dishonorable nature and order the hero to be filled with holes. This never worked, of course, the hero would somehow survive to prevail. But those were just stories, and it seemed to work perfectly fine here. It was quite the juxtaposition with Baroness Saradnik's apparent nature. She was upright and earnest, with a consistently stalwart disposition that would remind one of a hero rather than a villain. When it came to a fight, however, she seemed to possess no scruples whatsoever. The Baroness invariably pursued the most effective methods of destroying her enemy as possible. It didn't matter if what she did would be considered dishonorable, unfair or outright atrocious. He wouldn't be surprised if she had something stashed away in her bags to envenom her weapons with. According to Shiltir, that her opponents were mindless undead was not a factor. Anyone who she considered an enemy received a lethal dose of her cold efficiency. Shiltir. Yes, Ainz Summer? If we were to, say, send her to aid an ally at the head of an army, would our allies become just as horrified of us as their enemies? Probably not. What makes you say that? He asked. Ludmilla still operates according to the Sorceress Kingdom's policies in everything she does, Shiltir answered. She will also observe any limitations you place and work to accomplish specific objectives. If she's instructed to play nice, then she'll play nice in the most efficient way possible. I see. Well, that's a relief to hear. Will you be sending her somewhere, Arinsuka? Would he? There were clear benefits to doing so if the opportunity presented itself. If she had a firm grasp on the Sorceress Kingdom's national policies, Nazarik's priorities, and could do as Shiltir said, the Baroness was an ideal operative in certain situations. With the appropriate countermeasures, she was almost entirely indistinguishable from a regular human being. The Sorceress Kingdom was often seen as a nation of monsters by outsiders, so her presence might shift their perceptions. In addition, the risk to the NPCs would be lowered if they used local representatives for foreign diplomacy. A consideration for the future, he replied. Our administrators still have much to do in the Sorceress Kingdom. He turned his attention to the fight below, where the Baroness appeared to be testing something again. Is she trying to bait them into hitting each other as she did with the Wraith? Ah whoops, there she goes. With the crunch of several ribs, or perhaps all of them, the Baroness finally caught the brunt of one of the blood-meat Hulk's attacks. She flew several dozen meters before hitting the ground and rolled for a half-dozen more. To her credit, she popped back up to her feet once she regained control of her momentum. As Ainz watched her health tick up again, he was reminded of what he had witnessed earlier. During the fight with her first opponent, she used that three-pronged attack and lost health. Did she force her limit? Yes, in summer. Though he said it simply, forcing one's limit was nearly unheard of. Is that something she learned after she turned into a revenant? No, it's something from before. When she grasped her first martial arts, it was discovered that she could do this at the cost of crippling injuries. I heard the veteran adventurers were quite furious with her, but Mare and Pandora's actor were intrigued. I find it intriguing as well. We should send her to Gojin at some point. His wariness over martial arts had waned since the relative weakness of the region's inhabitants was established. Interest in martial arts fell off almost entirely when it turned out that both Nazarik's NPCs and his undead creations appeared to be incapable of learning them. The appearance of an intelligent undead capable of martial arts stoked the embers of his curiosity, however. The undead did not experience physical exhaustion, and it seemed she was perfectly willing and able to sacrifice health for the ability to exceed her level-based limits. What remained was to discover if the loss of mental clarity required to execute martial arts was a result of disruptions and loss of focus caused by physical wear and tear, or if it was associated with the mental stress that undead could still feel. If it was the former, an undead warrior could theoretically perform martial arts non-stop. Considering the outsized effectiveness that some of them possessed, it seemed an overwhelming advantage in an otherwise even fight. Heavy thuds sounded through the air as the blood-meat hulks once again came within melee range of the Baroness. She had returned to her previous method of fighting, rapidly inflicting light amounts of damage while mitigating risks to herself. She's regenerated to full, Ein said, but she's still moving strangely. He glanced over to Shiltia, but she shook her head unknowingly. The ground shuddered as one of the undead brutes crashed to the ground. Buried by a shower of arrows and spells, it was dispatched moments later. With the fight reduced to a duel, the Baroness settled for a more direct approach. Within half a minute, the blood-meat hulk was covered in punctures and lacerations. As expected, a zombie-ish creature was no match for a competent warrior, even when they had several levels on them. A third vial of holy water was emptied, and Ainz flew down to join her. "Do you always carry vials of holy water around?" he asked. "Undead are frequently used in the adventurer training area," she answered. "The content of Lord Mayor's courses are never announced in advance, so we eventually got used to bringing everything we might need to every session. These are from nearly 2 months ago. The infinite haversacks make everything so easy to carry around that I've become used to stockpiling everything." That was easy enough to imagine. 2 infinite haversacks could hold 1,000 kilograms worth of items with 100% weight reduction. Not only that, the items held within took no additional space. It was a degree of convenience unheard of in the region. The Baroness awkwardly leaned over, picking up an arrow from the ground. The entire thing disintegrated in her fingers. "How does the equipment that manifests with these undead work?" she asked. "At one point early on, I thought to order my skeleton archers to retrieve their spent arrows. Then I saw that they never seemed to run out of arrows. New ones appear in their quivers, but they are always just as shabby as the ones from before. Other undead seem to come with equipment of their own, but it all disappears when they are destroyed." Ainz pondered her question, having no real explanation. In Yggdrasil, everything was themed according to its location and flavor. A mob in an area with an Oriental theme would have weapons that one might find in an Oriental setting. Mobs that reflected a specific vocation, say, a ninja, would carry and use the equipment associated with ninjas. As far as he had seen, this sort of logic held out here as well. The region that Nazarik had ended up in was markedly Western, save for a few exceptions that he thought must be the result of player influence. A skeleton never spawned with a Nodaki, Makwawit Law Copa Sharandi Rantal. He rubbed his jaw in thought for several moments. Perhaps it might be best to explain like this," Ainz said. "Rather than trying to figure out where everything comes from, it is easier to accept that everything manifests from an idea, or a theme? A concept?" Ainz nodded. "That might be the best word for it. Have you ever wondered why the majority of the undead here have the bodies of humans? Undead are not limited to human form, yet most appear as such." Baroness Aradnik looked over the ranks of her undead forces. "I always thought it was because humans live here, or once lived here, so the undead that manifest appear as human remains. And when you imagine these remains, what comes to mind? What does a fallen warrior wield?" A villager? A farmer? Do you see that reflected here? Do you see any pieces of equipment that are foreign to this region? The Baroness fell silent, scanning the now emptied area with a thoughtful look. No, I haven't noticed anything that shouldn't be here, the Baroness nodded to herself. I've always taken it for granted, but if examined from that perspective, it stands out quite a bit. The undead here represent civilians and militia and are armed in the same fashion. All of the undead beasts are livestock or what should have been found naturally here before it became a wasteland. If we go deeper into the plains and encounter stronger undead, we might find guardsmen, knights or members of the aristocracy. These roles that once existed take shape in the appropriate species of undead for them. Oh boy, I hope I'm right. It seemed to work the way that it did in Yggdrasil, so he had just gone with the idea. He had no idea how he would explain himself if they came across a skeleton using a magical assault rifle. With the destruction of the undead being comes the dissolution of the concept it once represented, the noblewoman said. What manifested the equipment is now no more, so the equipment naturally vanishes as well. I would think that the economics of the region would be vastly different if it wasn't the case, Ayn said lightly. Places like the Katsa Plains would be treated as highly valuable resources where all manner of materials can be procured. People would go in with wagons and come out with piles of weapons and armor to sell. The mightiest would delve deeply into the plains, seeking opponents that yield rarer, more valuable materials. That does sound rather silly, Your Majesty, the Baroness snorted. I can't imagine what sort of strange world it would be if one could do as you mentioned. Ayn decided to leave it at that, lest he step into some unseen pitfall. Baroness Aradnik returned to the front of her company. Now that we've completed clearing the ruins, she said, what do we do with these? You should keep them for the next place, he replied. We can have them follow along the shore of the river, and they won't have any issues crossing should we investigate something on the other side. The undead marched off towards the ruined harbor. Ayn, Shiltir and the Baroness started searching through the ruins. Like their previous location, there was little to be found at all. No strong boxes or chests, no fragments of ancient books, stone monuments or carvings. No signs or lettering to be found in wood, stone, or metal. The buildings in the place did not have cellars, which made sense given that they were right by the river, and anything that should have weathered the ages like the towers had collapsed, their remnants scattered everywhere. Given the size of the former settlement and how difficult it should have been for the humans in the surrounding nations to access, Ayn started to lean in favor of the opinion that it had been purposefully destroyed. Erased, as the Baroness had put it. But by who, and why? Is it possible that some great war occurred here? The Baroness asked, one so intense that it gave rise to the Katsa Plains of today? With how the surrounding nations seem to cling to the ghosts of their past claims, he answered, one might think that they are the echoes of such a conflict surviving to this day. One that they have forgotten the true reason for, or have kept hidden from the light of day. What of the Sorceress Kingdom? Your Majesty has ancient claims in the area. Those claims were free rantle, he replied. The events that caused this, even what existed here at the time, is not a part of the Sorceress Kingdom's history. Ayn held a tense breath. He hadn't expected that particular fabrication to come around and haunt him. It was meant to be used once and forgotten. Usually a noble would question or challenge a claim, which none dared do since the Battle of Katsa Plains. That it would be brought up in this manner was entirely unforeseen. I see. With that, the Baroness continued her search, advancing towards the tower that loomed over the landscape. He eyed her strange movements, the ones that Shiltir had noted before. Why do you think she's walking like that? Her armor is mundane, so it must be something not working properly? Though he had already said as much, the realities of mundane equipment in this world still felt like a huge penalty to those who did not have magical equipment, which was most. This was probably because Yggdrasil did not have the same penalties. A player's avatar did not suffer any malices for damaged equipment aside from durability changes and loss of defensive function. After searching the base of the tower, which was similarly sealed from entry at ground level, the Baroness activated her hairpin and rose along its stone walls. As she approached the top of the broken tower, she peeked over carefully before rising to alight on the stones. What do you see? He called up to her. The inside of the tower is clear, she called back down. The interior has collapsed like the other one. Clear? There's no boss? Maybe it's a spectral type? No, she has true sight, so she would be able to see it. A high-level undead mouse, maybe? He flew up with Shiltir to join the Baroness above the tower. Ainz was about halfway there when Baroness' eyes widened in alarm. She rose all of 3 meters before a fleshy tendril wrapped itself around her ankle. With a startled noise, she was yanked into the tower and out of sight. You must have a thing for tentacles. Ainz couldn't say he wasn't tempted to say it, but he had a feeling that Shiltir eventually would. Baroness Zaradnik's only response to Shiltir's comment was a drawn-out sigh from where she sat on a large chunk of rubble. She pulled off one of her boots, scowling down at it. The sole was eaten through entirely, as well as the stocking inside. It's a good thing you're immune to acid damage, Ainz offered. Otherwise, that would have been quite the excruciating ordeal. The Baroness looked up at him, then blushed and turned away. Her embarrassed reaction was to be expected, in more ways than one. Not only had the acid eaten through her boots, but it had also gotten through much of the organic matter of her equipment. Bare skin showed through holes in her armor and everything looked just about to fall off. Like her boots, most of her minor magic items were ruined. She wiped her bare arm with a towel, then frowned as the towel was eaten away by the droplets of potent acid. What was that thing? The Baroness asked. A gargantuan mimic, Ainz told her. It must have become one of the undead somehow. Once Ainz had flown to the top of the tower and realized what was going on, he used his undead domination on the mimic and ordered it to spit out the Baroness. Less than 10 seconds had passed, but it was enough to leave her equipment in its precarious state. While the potent digestive acid couldn't harm her, he was fairly certain that she wouldn't have survived being munched on. Even if she could, clawing her way out might have damaged the interesting specimen severely. A group of researchers from Ashurbanipal were gated in to make a study of the creature while Ainz maintained his control over it. Were you able to get a sense of how strong this mimic is? Yes, she replied. It's far stronger than I am, probably about the same as a Death Knight or Death Warrior. Another 2 towels disintegrated in the Baroness' hands. Ainz held out his palm. Create greater item. A soft, white towel appeared in his hand. He held the item out to Shiltir, who gracefully received it and went over to the Baroness. While she helped her vassal clean up, Ainz mused over the existence of the creature lurking in the tower. How likely would it be for a rare type of mimic to appear as one of the undead in that exact location? I wonder if it grew to that strength after becoming undead, Ainz murmured, or if it was that strong beforehand. How would it get there in the first place? The Baroness asked as she dried her hair. Smaller ones can move around, Ainz told her. It must have been there for a while, growing too massive to relocate itself. Maybe it was someone's pet, or perhaps an experiment or a trap, or all of the above. Rantel uses slimes in its sewers, and that mimic's acid does just as good a job, so it may have been used for waste management. By the way, mimics are shape changers. How did you fail to notice it with your true sight? It was buried in a thick layer of dust, she replied. Only when it started moving did I notice it. When I first discovered that I had true sight, I marveled over how it could reveal all sorts of things. Now, I find that it's often foiled in surprisingly simple ways. Baroness Zaradnik rose from her seat, wrapping the towel around herself. If you will please excuse me, Your Majesty, I would like to find some place private to change. Of course. We'll meet you back at the ship, Zaradnik Dono. The noblewoman made her way around the tower. Ainz flew back to the ship with Shiltir. After seating himself back under the canopy, he reviewed the recent episode. Less than 2 days and she's already out of commission. At his side, Shiltir immediately lowered her head. My apologies, Ainz Summer. He raised his hand, and Shiltir stilled her voice. I'm not blaming either of you, he told her. But this drives home the point about ensuring that important vassals are always properly equipped. No matter how carefully you cultivate their strength, they'll lose their effectiveness if their gear falls apart. It is as Ainz Summer says, aren't you? Well, it's not that you haven't tried. After her experiences here, and her ruined equipment, I'm sure she'll be more receptive to your offer. What did you have in mind, anyway? Shiltir produced a green notebook from her inventory. After flipping through a few dozen pages, she held it out for him to read. YKH01? It's how Perarancino Summer labeled the set, aren't you? Sheltier leaned in close to look at the page with him. I haven't been able to figure out what the letters mean, but the numbers always correspond to the same equipment slot. It goes from top to bottom, so O1 is the head, O2 is the face, O3 to O5 are the 3 head accessory slots, O6 is the body and so on, aren't you? Ainz scanned through the pages listing the equipment Sheltier had in mind. Under each label were the materials for the item frame, as well as the data crystals that went into it. Oh, she's pretty good at this. Wait a minute. Sheltier. Yes, Ainz Summer. He shifted away from the panting floor guardian slightly. These items are all level 60. Yes, Ainz Summer. Let me guess, the glaive you granted her is also from this set. It's one of the 3 weapons that come with it, aren't you? Ainz sighed, resisting the urge to scratch his head. The data crystals listed were common in Yggdrasil and had thus piled up over the years, but the star silver was, no, more to the point, Sheltier had gone completely overboard. You know that weapon you gave her can hurt you, right? And me. He was immune to the glaive's necromantic effects and the negative energy damage would do nothing to the undead. The physical damage would also be drastically reduced, considering their level difference. Still, being struck by the Baroness would be the most that any of the world's natives had ever done to him, especially when she could turn it into a bludgeoning weapon at will. Maybe Sheltier hadn't considered that. In Yggdrasil, the glaive would be considered a piercing and slashing weapon, which skeletons were resistant against. Ainz thought this the most likely case. An unfathomably powerful weapon to this world, yet nothing but a feather to him. Ainz flipped back and forth through the pages, taking note of what Sheltier was going for with the set. The resistances and immunities are all wrong. Did you come up with this while she was a human? Yes, Ainz Summer. Since I had so much trouble trying to get her to accept items, updating it wasn't a priority. Then let's do that right now, shall we? Also, we need to halve the level of this set. May I know why? Sheltier tilted her head curiously. It's fine to include common data crystals that aren't used to make high-level items, he told her, but we must be frugal with our prismatic ores. Additionally, the people of this place learn through effort and challenge. Throwing a level 60 set on a level 15 would trivialize everything and she would level at a snail's pace. We'll use adamantite, a material available in this world, to create these item frames. The data capacity we can achieve with them should result in the equivalent of a level 35 set. That will be sufficient protection against most things in this world. Sheltier leaned in close again, looking down at the lists on his lap. Ainz took the table beside his seat and placed it in front of him, laying the notebook down upon it. May I sit beside you, Ainz Summer? Ainz absently shifted over to make room for her, preoccupied with data budget calculations. The way data crystals were allocated in Yggdrasil had a certain order to it. First, one covered any incapacitating weaknesses. Second, one aimed for statistical benchmarks that were perceived as appropriate for one's build. An arcane caster, for instance, might want just enough resilience to survive 3 hits from a boss-type monster or its area of effect attacks. This in turn would allow a tank to get the boss's attention back and healers could react to the damage being received in time. Finally, came any specialized purpose one might have for the equipment. This included augmenting the effectiveness of skills or spells and improving defenses for tanks. Resistance gear was also commonly used, if one went to a place where fire damage was broadly expected, say, farming in Muspelheim, then having a set that made one immune to fire made things easier for everyone involved. This was especially pronounced when it came to healer endurance, as their mana pools were often a limiting factor to party longevity when grinding. The equipment Sheltier had designed followed the same, sequential design philosophy. These items are all built quite well, he told her. Where did you learn how to do this? All of the equipment Pereroncino Summer left with me were designed like this, Sheltier replied. I see. An obsessive min-maxer, everything Pereroncino created would be as close to perfectly optimized as possible, even equipment in the huge wardrobe that he made for Sheltier. In this world, many were not only plentiful and powerful in their own right, they were heirlooms that conveyed his knowledge and expertise as a power gamer to his daughter. The equipment meant for the Baroness was designed as a human player in Yggdrasil would. Immunities composed the core of the data allocation, death effects, energy drain, ability damage, poison, disease, paralysis, exhaustion and mind-affecting spells and abilities were all rendered impotent by the set. In addition, there was a freedom effect and time stop immunity. Can anyone outside of Nazarick even cast time stop? Shiltir appeared to be creating gear for players against players, going straight for the most optimal setup possible as her creator would. The second layer of data consisted of the attribute bonuses one would expect for a purely physical melee combatant. Past that point, the items were running out of data capacity. Shiltir added a smattering of weak resistances against common damage types, quick swap crystals, and a bit of regeneration to fill the remainder of her data budget. This race change of hers has turned out to be quite the advantage. I believe so, too, Summer. Something pressed up against his arm but he ignored it, mentally crossing out what was no longer required. Though the material for the item frames had gone from star silver to adamantite, it was not as simple as halving all of the bonuses that the equipment added. Data crystals could not be partially used, they needed to be replaced by weaker data crystals to remain within each item's budget. If she had remained a human, substantial sacrifices would have been required to stay within each item's data capacity. As a revenant, however, it felt like she had gained. The various immunities that were included on the original set were mostly things that the undead were naturally immune to. In addition, she did not need to eat or sleep as one of the undead, so it freed up the slot once occupied by the Ring of Sustenance. Her turn immunity meant that she did not require a Ring of Proof against undead control and banishment, freeing up her other ring slot. All these might have amounted to a small portion of a Divine class set's overall data capacity, but it would have taken up a disproportionate amount on a set of level 35 items. In addition to her damage reduction, 3 elemental immunities and sole weakness to fire damage, things felt rather open-ended. Fire immunity is impossible with this data budget, Ainz murmured. How much do you think she actually needs? Our frost dragons each have a greater ring of fire resistance, Shiltir replied. It's enough to stop a maximized fireball from a platinum rank adventurer. If Ludmilla is to wage war, however. If he took the Imperial Legions as the standard for a decent military in this world, a greater ring of fire resistance was sufficient. However, casters that stood above the rest, such as Fluda Paradine, existed who could put out damage that exceeded the ring's protective threshold. Unfortunately, trying to build against that would turn the equipment into a fire resistance set with little capacity for anything else. Being able to prevent damage from the fire spells of the mid-20s caster should be optimal. Why is that, Ainz Summer? It's because of the way people wage war in this world. Ainz tapped the table with a bony finger. Something along the lines of how the Baroness described orders of strength. The first casters that she comes into contact with will most likely be a part of the rank and file. If we assume that these would at best be fire-specialized elementalists around level 20, whose fire spells should be as effective as a regular mid-20s casters, these casters will see that she is either highly resistant against or immune to their fire spells. These rank and file magic casters will pass this information up the chain of command, and the notion of her being strong against fire will spread. Ainz grinned at Shiltir's realization of his gambit. In future clashes, they will opt to use spells that she appears to be more vulnerable to. A level 40 fire-specialized elementalist will use their much weaker backup damage spells against her. Knowledge of her immunity against fire dissuading them from wasting precious mana by casting fire spells against her. Also, he flipped through the pages, running his finger down the list of items as he calculated another possibility. In addition to the equipment having fire as its primary resistance, we'll add holy, light and positive energy resistance as secondary resistances. Since she will be leading forces composed of the undead, it is almost a certainty that these damage types will be used against her. The data crystals invested for this are likely to provide guaranteed returns in every battle that matters. As a bonus, considering the Baroness' reaction to taking holy damage, her enemies seeing the commander of an undead army taking reduced damage from these types of spells may create mass confusion. As expected of Ainz Summer, aren't you? Shiltir squirmed beside him, toying with the hearts and minds of enemies that have yet to even show themselves. He nodded to himself in satisfaction over his proposals for the equipment. Unfortunately, the two ploys ate up a good part of the equipment's data capacity. It was essentially powerfully enchanted adamantite armor with limited attribute bonuses and a trollish resistance scheme. He eyed the original set, wondering what he could do with what was left. 2 free rings. She won't be wearing the ring of non-detection anymore, Summer? Ah. The ring wasn't on Shiltier's list, and he had forgotten she was using one. Will it be necessary on a battlefield? He asked. She'll be surrounded by the undead. That's true. Ainz considered its applications on a campaign. It would make her impossible to detect through magic and certain skills by Nazarick, but that detriment turned into a benefit against her opponents. Spells, skills and abilities that made attempts to gather information directly about her or her equipment would similarly be foiled by the ring. Only physical reconnaissance would work, making it difficult for enemies to arrange assassinations or surgical strikes against a problematic commander. On second thought, he said, let's try it out for now. As for her other ring, it should be a ring of freedom, yes? Yes, Summer. That should be the only thing we need to carry over from the old set. Now to switch to level-appropriate accessories. Cuckoo, I'm glad I had some practice making adamantite equipment before coming here. After adjusting everything to level-appropriate values, his eyes fell upon the weapons at the end. Unlike her armor, the new weapons would be a strict downgrade as they did not possess any data crystals of a defensive nature. He pulled out one of the weapons he had crafted, pondering his options. What about something like this? He asked Shiltier, holding out the glowing holy blade. I believe a negative energy weapon would be more elegant, Summer. Well, there are matters of image as well. It would be good if she can serve as an effective marketing tool wherever she finds herself. Speaking of which, what does this equipment set look like? I still haven't figured out what those letters mean. Shiltier rose from her seat beside him, walking around the table to stand on the other side. Her equipment shimmered as it was replaced by what Ainz assumed was the set in question. I see, it's that set of item frames from Folkvanger. It was armor that he had seen countless times before. Folkvanger was a zone in Asgard, the realm of the goddess Freya. In both the mythology of Earth and the lore of Yggdrasil, half of the worthy slain in battle were chosen by the Valkyries to dwell with Odin in Valhalla. The other half were chosen by the Valkyries to join Freya in her hall of Sesromnia, located in Folkvanger. It was a mid to high-level zone, but one not often frequented by high-level players. Due to this and the fact that the mobs were ideal targets for a necromancer, he had spent a lot of time farming the guards there, warrior women who mostly wore the armor Shiltier now displayed before him. The set was quite popular for female characters even after they reached high levels, and the data books for the item frames sold well. Ainz was of the mind that the armor didn't go well on short character models, such as Shiltier's. The tall Baroness, however, was probably a perfect fit. Don't you think it has the whole pure look to it? He asked. In that case, a holy weapon would fit, no? Shiltier leaned forward to read her notes. Lord Peroncino made YKHW01 and YKHW02. 01 is a holy style weapon while 02 is an unholy style weapon, Arinshu. They both use the same item frame. W was probably to indicate a weapon, but Ainz still couldn't figure out what YKH was. The only time Peroncino did that sort of thing was if he was obfuscating one of his fetishes. In that case, he said, was there a particular reason why you chose the unholy variant? In addition to preferring its look, Shiltier replied, the effects of the weapon suit her combat style. Ainz put the holy sword away and looked down at the notebook. He supposed that was true. While he initially considered it a defensive style, it was mostly due to the fact that it did not have the forceful aggression of the other spear style he had seen. It seemed to wear down an opponent with low-risk attacks before striking decisively. Those decisive strikes, however, were every bit as powerful as those of the more aggressive style he had observed from the old worker. You're right about it complementing her combat style. Her quick, conservative strikes are individually light, but they'll still deliver ability damage from the weapon. Her targets will rapidly weaken, allowing her to switch to finishes faster. Am I correct? Yes, Summer. In that case, we can still fulfill that purpose while having it appear as a holy weapon. We can? Ainz jotted down the new design of the weapon, complete with data crystals appropriate to the budget of an adamantite weapon. I see. Shiltier's eyes lit up as his words appeared on the page. The ability damage is its own data crystal, as is the negative energy damage, Arinshu. By keeping the ability damage crystal and switching to a holy damage crystal, you end up with a holy weapon that acts like an unholy weapon, Arinshu. How devious. He was quite pleased by the dissonant notion, himself. That being said, they weren't the same data crystals as the ones on the original weapon. The new glaive had an enhancement bonus appropriate for a level 35 weapon, a keen edge data crystal, a minor holy damage crystal, a minor strength drain crystal, and a quick swap crystal. Since the holy enchantment was weak, it wouldn't glow brilliantly like the holy blade that Baroness Zaradnik was critical of. Heinz flipped through the pages for the new set of equipment, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. Everything seemed to fall into place quite well. He closed the notebook and held it out to Schultier. "Bring these specifications to Pandora's actor," he told her. "Have him craft everything using Amano Hitotsu-san's form. Contact me if you come across any oddities with the data budget." "By your command, Ein Sommer." Baroness Zaradnik appeared out of the mist. She had a crestfallen look, her usually impenetrable mask leaking hints of powerless frustration. As she made her way back onto the ship, Heinz noted that she was in civilian attire, which reminded him of one more thing. "Zaradnik Dono," he called out to her. "The Elder Liches are still making a study of that fellow in the tower, and there are a few things that must be done back in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. We'll be taking a break until later tonight.